October 22, 1983. Two CEOs are murdered in cold blood. Both hits are planned by the Aryan Brotherhood, and what followed changed the U.S. prison system forever.
You make an example, and you do it publicly, in the light of day. If it comes to it, you'll run them down into the warden's office, you'll put them on the warden's desk. That's how the Aryan Brotherhood functioned.
Here are some of the most feared gangs in U.S. prisons.
In the shocking overnight murder of the head of Colorado's prison system, Tom Clements was gunned down as he answered the front door of his Monument home last night.
March 19, 2013. A man answers his door thinking it's a pizza delivery. Seconds later, he's dead. That man was Tom Clements, the executive director of Colorado's prison system. And the guy posing as a delivery man was Evan Abel, a parolee, a career criminal, and a member of a prison gang most people hadn't heard of until that day, the 211 crew. Clements' murder wasn't just tragic, it was a turning point. It forced the public, law enforcement, and prison officials to ask, how could a gang that started in jail reach this far? How could they get to someone like Clements? But to understand this, we have to go back to where everything started. 1995, Benjamin Davis, a 19-year-old inmate in Denver County Jail, was jumped by a group of African-American inmates. They used a sock stuffed with soap bars to beat him so badly his jaw was shattered, and they nearly threw him over a third-floor railing. He would have died if another inmate hadn't stepped in and pulled him back. After that, Davis made a decision. Never again. If he couldn't count on the guards and couldn't survive alone, he would build something. He started scribbling the name 211 Crew on the walls, trying to make it look like a white gang already existed. At first, it was a bluff, nothing but a rumor, but then other inmates started asking how they could join, and soon, what started like a fake name quickly became real. Davis wasn't trying to survive anymore. He was building a gang. They set up some rules, ranks, nicknames, and tattoos. They pulled from Nazi imagery, Viking mythology, even Irish symbols. Members would call each other mugs. The vibe was part white pride, part warrior cult. And while some members had mixed-race kids and claimed not to be racist, the gang's violence, especially toward African-American inmates, told a different story. The contradiction became one of 211's strangest traits: blurry lines about race, but deadly clear expectations when it came to loyalty. Cross the gang or make them look weak, and you were dealt with. No questions and absolutely no exceptions. And as their numbers grew, so did their reputation for being organized, disciplined, and brutal. Davis set up a structure straight out of a military playbook. We had soldiers, enforcers, crew leaders, and generals. Every hit, every assault had to be approved from the top. Even behind bars, Davis ran the show, sending coded messages, managing drug smuggling operations, and giving orders from solitary. So by the 2000s, the 211 crew wasn't just a Colorado problem. Its leaders were now locked up in prisons all across the U.S., and they still found ways to communicate through their coded letters hidden in books, slang-laced phone calls, and even artwork that worked as encrypted messages. Then came Evan Abel. He was out on parole after a clerical error, and no one noticed when he cut off his ankle monitor. In the days that followed, he killed a pizza delivery guy and stole his uniform to get close to Clements. Abel knocked on the prison chief's front door, dressed like this delivery guy, and when Clements answered, boom, Abel shot him dead, and then he ran. Police chased him down a Texas highway. He crashed into a truck and got out shooting. When the dust settled, Abel was dead. But the questions were just getting started. Phone records show that Abel had been in contact with high-ranking 211 crew members in the days before and after the murder. A hit list was found. Investigators believe the gang may have ordered that killing as retaliation for recent prison crackdowns. So soon after this assassination, the state of Colorado started quietly moving 211 leaders across the country. They didn't want shot callers sitting in the same cell blocks running operations like generals in a war room. So they used the Interstate Corrections Compact, a kind of prisoner swap program to spread them out. Wyoming, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, and New Hampshire. And it was smart, in theory at least. But some gang experts warned even more retaliation, saying,
"These guys are seeds. Wherever they go, they'll just start growing again."
2017, Benjamin Davis was found dead in his cell in a Wyoming prison. The official cause of death was suicide, but some inside the gang didn't buy that. They believed that he was murdered. Others saw it as a sacrifice, something that would elevate him to martyr status inside the 211 crew. One former gang member even said,
"They'll write a different version of his death in their book. He'll become something bigger now."
And that's the thing with groups like 211. You can move around their leaders, you can lock them up in solitary, you can even bury them. But if their ideology lives on, so does the gang. And while 211 may not be the largest gang in U.S. prisons, not by a long shot, but they've managed to plant fear all the way to the top of Colorado's correctional system. They've shown how prison walls don't always stop power or violence from leaking out. And that's what makes them so feared. July 22nd, 1978. What started as a regular morning at Pontiac Correctional Center in Illinois soon turned into one of the deadliest prison riots in the state's history. More than 1,000 inmates took over the prison. They weren't just fighting each other, they were going after the guards. 3 COs are killed, and entire buildings are set on fire. It was chaos. But it wasn't random. See, behind that riot, quietly, powerfully, was a man named Larry Hoover, the founder of the Gangster Disciples. And well, he didn't throw a punch that day. He didn't have to, because by that time, his gang was already running things behind the walls. Now, before we dive deeper into what the gang is really capable of, let's rewind. Back in 1964, a 13-year-old kid named Larry Hoover joined a small crew in Chicago called the Supreme Gangsters. He was smart, tough, and already had a presence. Meanwhile, another gang, the Black Disciples, led by David Barksdale, was gaining ground on the other side of town. And for years, those two gangs were at war. But in 1969, something unexpected happened. Hoover and Barksdale called a truce. They merged their crews into one powerful alliance, the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. And just like that, these two groups built something bigger. And within a few years, they controlled most of Chicago's South Side. But unity doesn't always last. Barksdale died young, kidney failure at 27, and Hoover took over everything. By the late 80s, he had turned his focus fully toward building out the Gangster Disciples. And it didn't sit right with everyone. Some felt pushed out, disrespected, left behind, and so they would split. Now, one side stayed loyal to Hoover and called themselves Gangster Disciples. The other revived the Black Disciples name and kept Barksdale's legacy alive. And that split quickly turned violent. 1991, a high-ranking Black Disciple leader named Mickey Bull Johnson was gunned down. The motive was simple: retaliation and street politics. No one ever officially said it, but everyone knew what it was about. And the fact that Hoover was the one calling the shots, he was never convicted. Because by this point, Hoover was already serving time for murder. But prison wouldn't stop him, you see. If anything, it gave him structure. He turned the Gangster Disciples into something more than just a gang. It had ranks, rules, codes, and operated like a business. This guy ran it like the CEO from prison.
Larry Hoover is still directing the criminal activities of the Gangster Disciple street gang from his prison cell. Those activities include extortion, drug dealing, and violent crimes.
At their peak, the Gangster Disciples were believed to have tens of thousands of members in over 30 states. They would bring in serious money through drugs, extortion, fraud, you name it. And in prison, they had influence to control everything from food to protection to phones. So in short, they weren't just a threat, this was an institution. And their power showed itself in violent, very public ways. 1993, the notorious Lucasville riot takes place at Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. It lasted for 11 days. Multiple gangs like the Gangster Disciples, Black Muslims, and the Aryan Brotherhood actually worked together. It was surreal. The prison was overcrowded, tensions were sky high, and inmates were fed up. In the end, 9 inmates and 1 CO were killed, and every day representatives from those gangs met in a little makeshift council, like generals in a war room. 2018, another riot at Lee Correctional Institution in South Carolina. 7 prisoners died, and again, the Gangster Disciples were right in the middle of it, clashing with the Bloods and Crips. It started over a cell robbery, but spiraled into one of the deadliest prison riots in 25 years. Even outside prison, the violence followed him. One of the most crazy things was back in 2005, at a U.S. military base in Germany. A soldier named Jawan Johnson was killed in a Gangster Disciple initiation. This guy was beaten for 6 straight minutes. One of the airmen involved was actually the leader of a Gangster Disciples set on base. So if that proves anything, it's how far their reach had gone. However, the system eventually managed to catch up. Let's go to 1995. After a 17-year investigation, Hoover was indicted again, and this time it was for running a criminal empire from prison. Wiretaps proved that he was still in charge, still making money, and still giving orders. 2 years later, he's convicted and given 3 more life terms. You know where he's at now? ADX Florence, the most secure prison in the country. Jump to 2022. Hoover publicly claims that he had cut ties with the Gangster Disciples. He said he wanted nothing more to do with the gang. Some believed it, others not so much. Today, the Gangster Disciples are more fractured than they used to be. Leadership isn't as centralized, but the name still holds weight. The network still exists, and their presence inside prison walls is still very real. They've caused riots, run drug rings, ordered hits, all from behind bars. And reports say they like to smuggle synthetic drugs into prisons. So to this day, for many COs, just hearing the name Gangster Disciples is enough to put them on edge. But when a gang has been around this long, this organized, this embedded, it's not about who's in charge. It's about what's already been built. And in the case of the Gangster Disciples, what's been built still runs deep.
Blood mean togetherness, unity. The B mean for better. The L mean for look. The O mean out. The other O mean or. And the last mean die. You better look out or die.
April 15th, 2018. It started like a lot of prison fights do. Someone stole from the wrong guy. But this day, inside a Lee Correctional in South Carolina, this robbery led to blood and death. A lot of guys rushed into the common area with makeshift knives. Within minutes, there was not just a fight, but a full-on war. 7 men dead and 17 injured. It was the deadliest prison riot in the U.S. in 25 years, and it takes 7 hours for officers to take the prison back. 7 hours. That tells you everything about how out of control it was. Now, the prison was home to some of the most dangerous people in the state, many tied to violent gangs like the Bloods, Crips, and Gangster Disciples. But the Bloods were the biggest in this area, and when the violence erupted, they weren't bystanders. After the riot, nearly 30 inmates were indicted on murder and conspiracy charges. But the bigger message was clear. The Bloods, especially the United Blood Nation, weren't just active in prison. These guys are running it. So who are they? And how did they become one of the most feared prison gangs in the country? We go to 1993, Rikers Island. This is where the United Blood Nation, UBN for short, was born. Not on the streets, but in prison. 2 men made it happen, Omar OG Mac Porty and Leonard OG Deadeye McKenzie. You see, back then, prisons in New York were mostly run by Latino gangs like the Netas and Latin Kings. For African American inmates, it was like survive or die. OG Mac saw this and decided to unify all the scattered black street gangs into one group. That's how UBN came to life. First as protection, then as power.
When OG Mac forms the United Blood Nation, they transform themselves from the prey to the predators.
The original sets would include 9 Trey Gangsters, G-Shine, 6 Money Murder, 183 Gangster Bloods, and more. The idea was pretty simple. How about we stop fighting each other and stand together? And guess what? It worked. Once they got out of prison, members took UBN to the streets, spreading through New York, Jersey, the Carolinas, and beyond. These guys were making noise and growing fast, and they brought structure and chaos with them.
What you just say in the war, man?
CK. That's for Crip Killers.
Now, UBN isn't like a loose group of boys throwing gang signs. It's organized. There's a hierarchy, a chain of command, codes, rules, and dues. These guys got a rule book called the 31, a set of laws every member's expected to memorize. Break those rules and you get disciplined. Become a snitch and you're done. Disobey orders, and you're lucky if all you lose is your rank. Now, in every prison, leaders are still calling shots, using smuggled phones and messages passed through visitation and letters. One guy, Pedro Gutierrez, was running things from his cell in New York while serving time for a murder charge, and he was controlling operations in several other states, including ordering hits. And when members got out, they wouldn't leave the life behind. They brought it with them, and they expected nobody to stand in their way. 2014, one of the most brutal displays of UBN violence unfolded in South Carolina, where Douglas and Deborah London were shot and killed inside their home. Investigators later found out that Douglas had defended himself during a store robbery months earlier. He pulled a gun on the robber and hit him. Now, that robber was Jamel Curtin, leader of a UBN set called Valentine Bloods. While sitting in jail, Curtin decided Douglas had to die, passing calls, letters, and messages to other gang members. And obviously, the hitman was another UBN member. What about Deborah, though? She wasn't even a part of anything. She was just standing next to her husband when that doorbell rang. Curtin later said she was collateral damage. It's pretty chilling, brutal even, and it shows you just how far UBN's willing to go and how much power they still hold inside prison. So this brings us all the way back to Lee Correctional. The riot wasn't a surprise to the people who knew what was going on. You see, that prison had been a pressure cooker for years, overcrowded, understaffed, barely controlled, and full of gang tensions. The Bloods would be the largest group, and everyone knew it. You had Crips and Gangster Disciples teaming up just to survive, and when the fight started, it wasn't about a stolen item. We had gang politics, debts, and even turf wars. One guy stabbed another, then a retaliation, then chaos. And because officers were lacking, it just kept spreading from one spot to the next. Some inmates ran, others hunted. And by the end of that night, 7 people were dead, and none of the staff had been hurt. Because the inmates weren't after guards here, they were after each other. The feds had made several attempts to bring down UBN, and truth is, they did score some major wins. Back in 2002, the gang's founder, Omar O.G. McPorty, was convicted on 10 serious charges: racketeering, murder, drug trafficking, even credit card fraud. This guy got 50 years and is now locked up, guess where? ADX Florence. In 2017, the feds had taken down 83 members of UBN in one of the biggest gang indictments ever on the East Coast. Charges like murder, robbery, drug trafficking, and fraud. Most of them were convicted, including Pedro Gutierrez, who got 20 years, but that wouldn't stop the machine. 2018, rapper Tekashi 6ix9ine, having ties to UBN's 9 Trey Gangsters, was arrested. His trial pulled the curtain back on the gang's inner workings, showing the public just how violent and messy things could get. But it wouldn't stop here. More cases followed. Human trafficking of minors by UBN sets in the Bronx. Sexual exploitations tie him to Imperial Gangster Bloods. Drug rings, weapons trafficking, murder for hire. All coordinated from inside prison walls. Law enforcement kept pushing, but every time, UBN kept pushing back, even from within prison. November 28, 2007, at USP Beaumont, Texas, 2 inmates, Mark Snar and Edgar Garcia, were being escorted back to their cells. It's a routine walk, just another day in one of the most violent federal prisons in America. The guards didn't really think much of it. They should have, because within seconds, the entire situation turns upside down. Snar and Garcia had slipped out of their restraints. No one really knows how. And then, before anyone could react, they went straight for the guards, pulling out homemade shivs and stabbing them over and over. Then they did something even more chilling. They take the keys off the wounded guards, unlock a nearby cell, and drag out inmate Gabriel Roan, their real target. And without hesitation, they stabbed him 50 times. Blood splattered on the walls. The guards were barely alive, and Roan never stood a chance. By the time backup got there, Snar and Garcia were standing over his lifeless body, hands still gripping their makeshift blades. And well, that's exactly what the soldiers of Aryan culture do. Now, if you haven't heard of the soldiers of Aryan culture, you're not alone. They're not as famous as the Aryan Brotherhood, but inside prison, they're just as feared. They're younger, meaner, and they've got something to prove. Let's go to 1997. The gang is founded by Tracy Tin Man Suena, a white inmate in Utah who decided that he needed his own version of the Aryan Brotherhood. Unlike older gangs that had been around for decades, the soldiers of Aryan culture was the next generation of white supremacists, more brutal, more disciplined, and more organized than people gave them credit for. And they're not just like a loose group of racist inmates here. They too had a system, a military-style ranking structure consisting of generals, captains, lieutenants, sergeants, and soldiers. They would have a strict code, loyalty above all, and violence as a way of life. So to be able to get in this, you gotta go through a 6 to 12-month probation period, where a new recruit would have to attack other inmates just to be considered. If you survived your test, you'd get your patch, swastika tattooed into an iron cross, and some earned SS bolts, marking them as enforcers who had taken lives for the gang. And once you got that ink, there's no leaving. Now, it's one thing to kill your enemy. That's standard prison gang business. But soldiers of Aryan culture take things a step further. They police their own members just as viciously as they go after their enemies. And if you break the rules as a member, let's just say you won't be around long enough to regret it. March 3rd, 2014. Again at USP Beaumont. Here we have soldiers of Aryan culture members Christopher Kramer and Ricky Fackrell deciding one of their own had to pay for what they had done. Leo Johns, another member, had broken the gang's code. He'd been caught gambling and drinking. The gang sees that as weak, and in soldiers of Aryan culture, weakness gets you killed. So, they spent 3 months planning his murder, and when the time came, they stabbed him to death right inside the prison, just like that. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just cold, calculated violence. Kramer and Fackrell were both convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 2018. But to their gang, these guys were soldiers following orders who would be hailed as martyrs if they are executed. The soldiers of Aryan culture aren't just a problem behind bars. We go to 2002. They almost take their violence to the outside world with a full-blown terroristic attack. At the time, authorities uncovered a plot to bomb Jewish athletes at the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City. Their plan was pretty simple: build pipe bombs, unleash hell. And thankfully, it didn't happen. Law enforcement got to him first. But the fact that it was even in motion shows you how far they're willing to go. They wanted to prove that they're not just a prison gang anymore, but a whole movement, and that made them really dangerous. So by 2003, the FBI had seen enough. A massive RICO indictment took down 12 SAC leaders, locking them away with sentences ranging from 3 to 20 years. But as you've already seen, that didn't kill the gang, because violence doesn't need a leader, it just needs a system. And the soldiers of Aryan culture had built a system that ran on bloodshed, especially from behind bars. Now, outside of prison in 2020, authorities found out that the gang is still running drug trafficking operations, with 21 members charged in Utah for smuggling heroin, meth, and illegal firearms. And to this day, the gang refuses to die. Behind prison walls, they still command with fear, because they've proven that they'll kill for their beliefs. They're gonna follow their orders without question, and that even when law enforcement cuts off the head, the body keeps moving. And when a gang rewards violence, runs like an army, and trains its members to think of murder as discipline, they don't just disappear. That's why the soldiers of Aryan culture are still one of the most feared prison gangs in America today. August 21st, 1971. Gunshots ring out at San Quentin State Prison in California. The sound of bodies hitting the cold concrete floor echo throughout the yard. When the chaos is finally over, George Jackson, the man who started it all, lay dead, gun still in hand, blood soaking through his clothes. But he wasn't the only man down. By the time the dust settled, 3 guards and 2 other inmates were also gone. Just like that. Prison officials said it was an escape attempt gone wrong. However, Jackson's followers called it an execution, because for them, this wasn't just about one man. This was about power. It was about a movement that had started years earlier inside some of the toughest prisons in America, and it was about a gang that would go on to become one of the most feared forces behind bars, the Black Guerrilla family. Most prison gangs are formed for one thing: survival. They stick to their own race, run drugs, try to protect their turf. Now, the Black Guerrilla family, however, was a bit different. Again, this wasn't just a gang. They were a movement. 1966. George Jackson founded the group while locked up at San Quentin State Prison. Now, this guy was pretty intellectual, a revolutionary, a man who saw the prison system as just modern-day slavery, and he wanted to change that. Inspired by the Black Panther Party and even Marxist-Leninist ideals, Jackson and his co-founders W.L. Nolan and George Big Jake Lewis built the guerrilla family on the belief that the black inmates needed to unite, not just to survive in prison, but to rise up against what they saw as an oppressive system. Their goals were nothing short of overthrowing the U.S. government. Sounds extreme, but they were deadly serious. And while most gangs focus on maybe drugs and extortion, the Black Guerrilla family had a different agenda. They wanted to build a structured, politically motivated group, and they used violence to back it up. Revenge wasn't just a part of their code, it was a priority. 1970, a white prison guard shoots and kills 3 African-American inmates in the yard at Soledad Prison in California. A few days later, that same guard was found dead, beaten, and thrown off the 3rd floor. So, just a coincidence? Not a chance. 3 Black Guerrilla family members, including George Jackson, were charged with his murder. They became known as the Soledad Brothers, sparking a national movement that would draw support from civil rights activists, including Angela Davis. But Jackson never lived to see his day in court. August 21, 1971, just days before his trial, Jackson is shot and killed by guards in San Quentin. The official story says that Jackson was being escorted back to his cell after a meeting with his lawyer, when suddenly he pulled out a 9mm pistol, a gun that somehow made it past security. In an instant, chaos erupts and Jackson orders a guard to unlock every cell in the adjustment center, San Quentin's most secure unit, housing some of the most dangerous inmates. And just like that, all hell breaks loose. Fighting spread between the Black Guerrilla family and the Mexican Mafia, 2 rivals with a long history of bloodshed. And within minutes, inmates are stabbing each other, guards are dragged into cells, and violence explodes across the prison. By the time the gunfire stopped, 2 white inmates lay dead, their bodies stacked on top of a wounded officer as a warning. 3 COs are also killed. 1 had his throat slashed, while 2 others were thrown off the tier onto the blood-soaked floor below. In the middle of it all, Jackson made a run for the prison yard, but a sniper takes him down before he escapes. A single bullet rips through his spine and out of his skull, ending his life instantly. The aftermath was brutal. Guards retaliated by beating the crap out of surviving inmates, some of whom later claimed that they were tortured for days. Meanwhile, on the outside, Jackson's death set off uprisings in prisons across the country, fueling the belief that he'd been executed to silence him forever. So his death turned him into a martyr. His book, Soledad Brother, became a Bible for new recruits. And the Black Guerrilla family wasn't just a prison gang anymore. They were legend. By the 1980s, the gang had spread beyond California and into the federal and state prisons across the country. These guys are beyond surviving, and now they're running the system from the inside. In 2013, a crazy thing happens out in Baltimore City Detention Center. Here, Black Guerrilla family leader, Tavon White, would be the king of the prison, and the guards worked for him. Wiretaps caught him bragging, saying,
"This is my jail. Nothing happens unless I say so. You want to stab someone? You ask me first."
And this dude wasn't exaggerating. He had the guards smuggling in drugs, weapons, and cell phones for the gang. And these guys were making a fortune doing it. It's pretty insane, right? But check this. 4 female CEOs get pregnant with his kids. 2 even have his name tattooed on them. Can't make this shit up. Then finally the FBI steps in. They arrest 25 people, including 13 CEOs who'd been working for the gang. Guys, this was one of the biggest cases of prison corruption ever uncovered. And well, for a gang that started like a political movement, it just proves that the Black Guerrilla family ended up becoming the same as the groups they once opposed. Call it adaptation, who knows? They even built alliances with Latino gangs like Nuestra Familia, but waged war against the Aryan Brotherhood and Mexican Mafia, leading to some really brutal prison murders throughout history. Ooh, and if you crossed them, you died. Simple. 1989, Black Guerrilla family members assassinated Huey P. Newton, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party that had once inspired them. Now, why did they do that? Well, it's because he had a drug debt with one of their dealers, and they made sure he paid in blood. About in 1979, a former Black Guerrilla family lawyer, Faye Stender, was shot 5 times by one of the gang's hitmen, simply because she had betrayed the movement. Now, she survived that attack, but later took her own life because she couldn't live with that trauma. Today, the Black Guerrilla family is still alive and thriving, especially in California and Maryland prisons. They've totally shifted from a revolution to drug trafficking, extortion, and controlling prison economies. Their reach extends beyond the prison, influencing street gangs and a lot of criminal networks. They still kind of carry that political image, but make no mistake, this is not a gang about ideology anymore. They're about power, control, and survival. And inside America's toughest prisons, it's about who runs the system.
When you make a commitment to the NF, it's a lifetime commitment. I was asked things like, are you willing to kill your own flesh and blood? You know, are you willing to put the organization first before everything else in your life?
December 17th, 1972, Rodolfo Cheyenne Cadena, a prominent figure in the Mexican Mafia, stepped out of his cell at Chino Reception Center. He knew this was a death sentence. Word had spread all over the prison, and the threats were real. He could have stayed in his cell, but instead he chose to walk out, and minutes later he's surrounded, stabbed over 50 times, and thrown off a third-story tier, and then stabbed again on the ground. Well, that moment changed everything. Cadena's murder kicked off a wave of prison violence that would echo for decades in the California correctional system, at least. And at the center of it all would be a group that would grow into one of the most feared gangs in the country, Nuestra Familia. So, how did this one even start? You see, back in 1965, inside Soledad Prison, a group of Mexican-American inmates from Northern California decided they'd had enough. Now, the thing is, California prisons at the time were dominated by the Mexican Mafia, La M, a powerful group made mostly up of guys from Southern California. But the northern guys were from small towns and farming communities. They weren't a part of this inner circle. Some say they were even mocked. Others say they were extorted. One story goes that the whole war started over a stolen pair of shoes. Either way, the norteños, or northern boys, banded together. They form Nuestra Familia. At first, it's always about survival, but before long, these guys are organizing, recruiting, and building ranks. And yeah, things eventually escalated. For example, Rodolfo Cadena's murder wasn't just the end of one man. It was a declaration of war. This guy was a high-ranking leader of the Mexican Mafia, and by killing him, Nuestra Familia was sending a clear message. But his death would mark a turning point. What followed was a brutal cycle of retaliation between the two gangs that turned California's prison system into a war zone. Now, what sets Nuestra Familia from the others is their structure. These guys are not just troublemakers in the yard. They operate like a paramilitary group. Again, we have generals, captains, soldiers, and believe it or not, they even have a written constitution. Yeah, a literal rule book.
A lot of the old NF members came from the Marines. They're ex-Marines, so they actually took a lot of the structure of the leadership in the military and brought it to the NF.
Once you're in for life. Members take a literal blood oath, and breaking these rules isn't just frowned upon, it's fatal. Things like prioritizing money, women, and drugs over the gang is a death sentence. And when it comes to cooperating with law enforcement, well, let's say that death won't be quick. And the gang doesn't just control prison tiers. They're out in the streets, operating drugs, extorting rackets outside the prison like crazy. Mostly through norteños, they're street-level foot soldiers. And leadership doesn't go away when they're locked up. In fact, many leaders continue to run entire networks from inside high-security facilities, like Pelican Bay. And that's why they've been on the FBI's radar for decades. So in the early 2000s, the Feds started cracking down hard on gang activity. Operation Black Widow would be a big one. This exposed Nuestra Familia's inner circle and led to a string of indictments. Authorities believe that the gang was behind at least 600 murders by that point, in and out of prison. Yet still, taking out the top leadership doesn't stop the machine. The organization just reshuffled and kept moving. By 2010, another sting, Operation Knockout, hit the Central Coast pretty hard. A few months later, we have Operation Street Sweeper, targeting even more leaders and soldiers, including guys running businesses on the outside while pulling strings behind bars. One of them would be a shop owner in Salinas, who authorities described as one of the highest-ranking Nuestra Familia leaders operating outside of prison. So yeah, the store was a front, and his real job was dealing drugs and managing soldiers like a CEO. But even when locked up, members like Vincent Garcia held command. Between 2012 and 14, Garcia was the regimental commander at Monterey County Jail, not just respected, but totally feared. In that 2-year span, he approved 10 violent murders inside that prison, and it wasn't random stuff. Hitters would stab the target, and then bombers followed, beating the guy to create a distraction. This gave the attackers time to ditch the weapons and blend back in. All of it had to be greenlit by Garcia. Nothing happened without his say-so. Later, he was given more time and transferred to a federal prison. By 2023, the FBI convicted 4 top Nuestra Familia leaders, including David D.C. Cervantes, James Coneo Perez, and 2 others. These guys were generals, the ones making calls from inside a prison, authorizing murders, running drugs, and keeping this whole thing alive. The court records show that they were behind murder plots, attempted hits, and even drug trafficking across every county in the Bay Area. Their communication system was via contraband cell phones, coded messages, and loyal soldiers on the outside. But imagine this, even behind bars they're calling shots, controlling people, and taking lives. So, what's the difference? And this is because Nuestra Familia, again, isn't just a gang. We have a system. They're very organized, ruthless, and deeply rooted into the California prison environment. What started as a way to protect vulnerable inmates evolved into something far more dangerous. And while some of the big names are finally behind bars for good, perhaps put in segregation even, the organization really still exists. It's still operating out there, and it still makes people nervous both inside and outside the prison gates.
Federal prisons are under lockdown all across the country. It was prompted by a fight inside a Texas facility. The U.S. Bureau of Prisons says 2 inmates were killed in that clash.
January 31st, 2022. A fight breaks out at USP Beaumont, Texas. 2 inmates are stabbed to death over growing tension between members of the Mexican Mafia and MS-13. Now, what started like a violent prison brawl quickly escalated into something far bigger. Within hours, the whole federal prison system, every single one of them, went into lockdown. Because that's how powerful the Mexican Mafia is, aka La M. One prison fight, and the whole country reacts. That's because prison officials know La M isn't just a gang here. We got a world of prison politics, and they're at the top of the food chain, especially in California. These guys aren't operating like a chaotic mob. They're more like a shadow government behind bars. Rules, structure, an army. This army, though, is called the Sureños, and they have thousands of members from different gangs, most notably MS-13 and 18th Street. Yeah, you heard that right. As those guys are fighting like cats and dogs on the streets, that rivalry gets paused the second they hit prison. Because in here, they fall in line under La M. And that deadly fight in Beaumont, it wasn't even between enemies, it was between people who are supposed to have each other's backs behind bars. But when the tension rose, even amongst allies, it didn't really take much for things to explode. Now, how does La M manage all that chaos? It's pretty simple and brutal. La M gives out the orders, and the Sureños carry them out. Hits, extortion, drug sales, name it. Behind bars, MS-13 and 18th Street become soldiers for the Mafia. And if they refuse, they get greenlit. That's gang code for being marked for death. But even on the streets, these gangs are expected to pay tribute and show respect. That's the grip La M holds, from the inside out. But how did it all start? We go all the way back to 1957. At a place called Dual Vocational Institution in Tracy, California, where 13 young Latino gang members from LA, guys from cliques like White Fence, Hawaiian Gardens, and Primera Flats, realized something. If they didn't unite behind bars, they wouldn't survive. So they formed what would become La M, short for La Mafia Mexicana, the Mexican Mafia. Now, at first, the idea was protection. But this wouldn't last long. Power like that never stays neutral. And within a few years, La M wasn't just protecting its people. It was straight up terrorizing others, stabbing the hell out of their enemies, and taken over every prison racket. Drugs, extortion, gambling, if it had a value, La M wanted control, and they got it through fear. Now, one of their most infamous earliest members was Rodolfo Cheyenne Sedena. Yeah, the same Sedena who was later assassinated by Nuestra Familia. But before that, he was a dude nobody dared to mess with. This guy was smart, strategic, and very ruthless. At San Quentin in the early 60s, he made his mark the day he arrived by killing a massive inmate who tried to humiliate him. And just like that, this man sent a clear message in California. You don't mess with La M. But all this violence doesn't sit right with everyone. Some Mexican-American inmates, especially those from rural Northern California, were kind of tired of being bullied by these city guys. So, in 1965, they break off and form their own gang. You guessed it, the Nuestra Familia, the farmers versus the gangsters. And with that, California's deadliest prison war began. 1968, the rivalry explodes during what's now known as the Shoe War. A La M member stole a pair of shoes from a Nuestra Familia supporter at San Quentin. Seems small, right? But that petty theft turned into an all-out riot. 19 inmates were stabbed, 1 died, and the hatred between the two gangs became permanent. From that point on, violence only escalated. Both sides would carry out hits in prison and outside, and while Nuestra Familia focused more on organizing their ranks, La M focused on power, territory, fear, and money. And guess what? They got all of it. By the 1970s and 80s, La M was running drug operations both behind bars and in neighborhoods across Southern California. So if you were dealing drugs in East LA, you're probably paying them a tax or risking your life. Even the infamous Joe Pegleg Morgan, a white man with no Mexican blood, rose to power as one of their top bosses because of his connection with drug suppliers in Mexico. That's how important money is for these people. And their influence really reached way beyond the prisons. They filtered their cash from public programs, infiltrated all kinds of community groups, and would even manipulate every type of street politic out there. This one time, they were reportedly skimming money from a government-funded drug rehab program called Get Going. The program's founder tried to expose them. Yeah, she ended up dead. And inside prison, they simply set the rules. No questions about it. La M enforced a blood-in, blood-out code. You join by spilling blood, and you leave by dying. They had a constitution, commandments, and expectations that ranked above everything else, including family, religion, and even God. That's not an exaggeration. It's actually written in their rules.
You do work, and work is basically stabbing people. You kill people in the organization, and that's how you escalate. That's how you advance.
Power isn't just about violence. It's about control through violence. They could stop drive-by shootings in East LA with one phone call. Seriously, 1992, Joe Morgan told Sureños to cut it out. For the next 5 months, not a single drive-by was reported in the neighborhoods where shootings were a daily thing. That's the kind of authority they had, and it held for decades. Even now, they're still a force to be reckoned with. Let's go to 2023. Raids across California and beyond led to dozens of arrests tied to Mexican Mafia operations. Drug trafficking, extortions, weapons, murder for hire. They had their hands in everything from meth deals to fentanyl rings. Then, in early 2025, a massive sweep by the San Diego police brought down 39 of their members and associates. They faced some serious charges like murder, arson, and weapons trafficking. And all of it was being orchestrated from inside a prison. Because even caged, La M is never out of the game. And maybe that's what makes them so terrifying. Not just all that violence and not the fear, but the fact that even behind bars, with nothing but time and a few loyal soldiers, they built an empire, one that still runs strong.
We control everything. Who lived where? Who died and who lived? We controlled the entire prison system.
October 22nd, 1983. At USP Marion, Illinois, a prison guard named Merle Klutz was doing what should have been a routine walk, just taking an inmate back to his cell after a shower. Now, this inmate was Thomas Silverstein. What Klutz didn't know was that Silverstein had a shiv on him, and a key to his cuffs. In one terrifying moment, Silverstein unlocks his restraints, pulls out his shank, and stabs Officer Klutz over 40 times. A few hours later, another guard, Robert Hoffman, was also killed by a different inmate using the same ambush method. 2 dead officers in one day? Suddenly, everything changed. Marion went into permanent lockdown. No inmates out of their cells, no recreation, and no movement. That was the day the U.S. officially created its first Supermax prison, and the Aryan Brotherhood just made it crystal clear how dangerous they were. So, who exactly are they? The Aryan Brotherhood, sometimes called AB or the Brand, ain't just another gang with some tats and bad tempers. This is one of the deadliest prison gangs in America. They've been around since the 60s and have their roots in California's San Quentin prison. See, back then, prisons were starting to desegregate. Tensions are rising, racial violence is exploding, and a group of white inmates decide to just form their own gang. Again, for protection, they claimed, but it didn't stay about protection for too much longer. They started calling themselves brothers. They came up with some blood oaths, some prison politics, and the most violent rituals. You didn't just join the Aryan Brotherhood, you earned your place, usually by spilling blood.
Your loyalty to the Aryan Brotherhood has to be more than your loyalty to your best friend, your family. If they see that your loyalty is strayed, you're next.
One of their most infamous members would be Thomas Silverstein, the same man who took out Klutz. But that wasn't his first kill. Before that, this guy was stabbing a rival gang member 67 times and dragging his body down the cell block like a warning sign. And that really was the message. You mess with the Brotherhood, you're next. By the 1970s, the Aryan Brotherhood was knee-deep in racial wars with the African Americans and Latino prison gangs. But their violence wasn't always about race. You see, if you crossed them, disrespected them, or even just owed them money, you wouldn't be walking out of your cell alive. And then, by the 1990s, the Brotherhood started shifting from senseless violence to more organized crime. They couldn't just stab people for the fun of it anymore. Now they're running entire drug rings from solitary confinement. They gotta sell meth, move that heroin, tax other criminals, and order as many hits from inside their cells using smuggled cell phones and coded letters. Even John Gotti, the mob boss of the Gambino crime family, reportedly reached out to them for protection in prison. If the Italians are asking you for protection, you know you're powerful.
You may sometimes be called to make a move on somebody, and that means kill them. There's no two ways about it. It might be a friend of yours, and you've got to do it. You're totally committed to that.
Now, in the 2000s, the FBI had to go after the Brotherhood hard. They tried breaking the gang using some RICO indictments, the same laws used against the Mafia back in the day. In 2002, 29 leaders were rounded up from prisons all over the country, many of these guys already serving life. The government aimed for the death penalty in 21 cases. But the death penalty is kind of hard to stick on guys who are already locked up for life. They really don't care about death. Most of them pled guilty, and only a few went to trial. Barry Mills and Tyler Bingham, 2 top leaders, got life without parole. Mills died in ADX Florence in 2018.
So the Bureau of Prisons said, how can we keep them from doing this? And the answer is what they called no human contact. Take everything away.
But prison never slowed them down. 2019, another major bust reveals that high-ranking members are still running a massive heroin and meth operation from inside of California's most secure prisons. Ronald Renegade Yandel, one of the gang's top leaders, used contraband cell phones to control hits and drug deals across the state. He would even promise new recruits full membership if they killed someone for the Brotherhood. Guess what? They did. And then there's Thomas Silverstein. After the brutal murders he committed in prison, the Bureau of Prisons kept him under the strictest conditions imaginable. No human contact, lights on 24/7, and only 2 phone calls a month for 36 years. He died in 2019, still in solitary, the longest held isolated prisoner in U.S. history. Some say he was a psychopath. Others say he was a product of the Aryan Brotherhood. Either way, his legacy shaped the Supermax model, built for the worst of the worst. built for the Aryan Brotherhood. Today, the Brotherhood ain't just a prison problem. It's a nationwide network. In 2020, the FBI cracks down 60 white supremacists connected to the Aryan Brotherhood and the Peckerwoods in a huge drug, weapons, and COVID relief fraud bust. These guys were scamming the government, moving fentanyl and meth, and enforcing their rules with guns and knives. They even had some uneasy alliances with gangs like the Mexican Mafia, sharing enemies like the Black Guerrilla family, and when rival gangs refuse to recognize the Brotherhood's authority, well, people end up dead. Simple as that. That's what happened when William Sylvester killed another inmate in 2001, just to earn his patch. But in the end, the Aryan Brotherhood ain't just a white supremacist gang. We got a criminal machine built on blood, fear, and loyalty. Oh boy, if you cross them, well, people have been stabbed over less.